Alright, here is my sanded shuttle. It's pretty smooth, and I have cleaned out the area where the hex nut's going to be glued in there. You want to make sure there's no little bits of support or plastic left in there. And if you have already decorated your shuttle or added varnish or any kind of decoupage or resin, you want to make sure this hole doesn't have any resin in it. You want to test and make sure that the screw head will go easily in and out, because the only purpose of this hole is to keep the screw from wobbling from side to side. You want to also test and make sure that hole is clean. Don't drill it out too much, because your pick will just wobble too much in there. Here's just a little scrap pick that I've got. You want to cut your crochet hook or whatever you're going to be using as a pick, and make sure that it's clean inside that hole. The next thing you need to test is, let's see, you can check and see if your shuttle is warped. Just put your hex nut in there temporarily. Just snap it down inside there, and you can try out your bobbins to see if they slide in and out. And I'm using metal and plastic. So I'm going to pop that back out of there. Okay, the items that this shuttle was designed around is an 832 nylon screw and the hex nut that matches. I bought one, I just bought some that were longer than 1/2 of an inch, because I felt like the 1/2 of an inch didn't grab onto the hex nut very easily, so I preferred cutting them to size. I have both metal and plastic sewing machine bobbins. These are class 66. Most of the older Singer sewing machines use the class 66 bobbins, and there are some newer mechanical machines that still use the class 66 bobbins. So I chose these to design the shuttle around instead of the class 15, which is more popular, because the class 15 was just a tad taller, and I was at my limit on how fat I wanted to make my shuttle. So these are class 66, either metal or plastic. Metal is a little bit heavier to work with. Sometimes you want the weight, especially if you need some weight on the shuttle that is for your chains. Sometimes I don't like the weight. So as far as supplies, you'll need something to cut the nylon screw with. I'm using these little cutters that came with my my 3D printer, and it's nice and flush, so I get a nice flat cut. You can use a craft knife, anything that you can cut really flat with. I bought these 0.5 millimeter hooks, and they were made for weaving hair, and it came with 3 hooks on it, so I was able to scavenge 3 hooks off of here. So I cut mine about 10 millimeters long, because I wanted it goes about 5 millimeters into this hole here, so I wanted about 5 sticking out. So you'd have to decide how far your pick needs to be sticking out. So when you get ready to glue your hook into your shuttle, this is just an old bent one, so I'm not going to use this one, but I would put a little super glue down into a little plastic container and dip it in there, and then I put it into my shuttle with the top of my shuttle up like I'm going to be tatting, and then with some tweezers I turn the hook in the direction I want my hook to go. Everybody's different in the way that they tat, but I liked my hook pointing to the right. So once you get it glued in there, you may need to hold it with tweezers for a few seconds until it kind of stays put, and then I usually come back with a little bit of glue here on the tip. Now I am not going to glue my hex nut in yet, because I need it to help me to cut my screw. But when you do glue your hex nut in, don't put the glue down into the bottom of the well right here. Trying to point at it. Put little tiny dots of glue along the outer walls of this little chamber, because you don't want any glue to get into the threads of your hex nut. And if I haven't already mentioned, these are a size 832 nylon screw with a hex nut to match. I 3D printed my little bearing, and I am going to put that inside of one of my bobbins to help me measure. I'm going to put the screw in, and then I'm going to go ahead and put the hex nut all the way down to where it's fairly tight. And I probably should have put the flat side of the nut, because it's got a little dome on one side, so I don't know that it really matters, but the flat side is what's going to be glued down inside of the inside of your shuttle. So I usually try to pay attention to that. Sometimes I forget and I glue it in differently, but it doesn't make a lot of difference. Okay, so I don't want my bobbin loose in there, but I'm just finger tightening it down, because this is going to give me the length that I need to cut this flush. You can back off a little if you want to, but the way I've done mine, I've just cut it flush. And the reason you don't want any screw sticking out of there is because once that hex nut is in place and you're going to be putting the bobbin in and screwing that screw all the way down, there's not a lot of thickness to this. I think that this is only a couple of millimeters, maybe 2.5, and if the screw is sticking out, you run the risk of cracking this plastic here. So I've not done any, I haven't damaged any of mine, but just make sure you cut it to the right length. So what I do with my little cutters here is I just make little tiny cuts all the way around. I don't want to cut this one, but it cuts really easily, so you just barely have to squeeze, and it makes little cuts, and then it makes it nice and flush against the hex nut. When you're using tatting shuttles that use bobbins, you want to make sure that you wind your thread on there firmly and evenly. Some of the thinner threads, like the size 20 and 40, I use the 40 sometimes. That's the one that gives me the most trouble, because if I wind it too squishy, when I'm pulling out more thread, that thin thread can sink down and lock up inside the layers of the squishy thread that's all around it. And so you'll keep loosening the screw on your bobbin or your shuttle trying to get this to loosen up, and it's the thread, it's not the shuttle. So this one I wound on a sewing machine, and it did a really nice job. So just be sure, and if it's too squishy, just unwind it and wind it onto a new bobbin, even if you have to do it by hand. Alright, to get ready to tat, this shuttle already has a hex nut glued down in there. I put my bobbin with the thread feeding off the bottom and to the right, and that slides right into the shuttle. I just hold it in place as best I can, and then put my little spacer in there and my cut screw, making sure it's not jumbly on the end. One of these other ones was giving me trouble because it was all chewed up on the end, and I was not able to catch the threads on the other side. So I can kind of feel that it rocked into that hex nut underneath. Sometimes it takes a little practice to get it to seat in there, and make sure again that your threads are okay on the ends of your screws. Alright, so I've got that about as far as it'll go without me forcing it, So I'm going to test my tension. That feels perfect to me. And the thread is, when I dangle this, it's not unwinding when I don't want it to. And then when I need to take up the slack, I can wind back on without the screw coming loose. So you're going to have to practice to figure out how tight you want that. If I go tighter, then it's going to be hard while I'm tatting to give me more thread. So it just takes tiny little adjustments. So you'll have to practice a little bit before you actually dive into a project to see how tight you want it. And sometimes you'll have to adjust as you go. But most of the time, once I get it where I want it, even when I'm pulling up more thread or letting out more thread, I usually don't have to do any more adjusting while I'm working on a project. So also the tension for the metal bobbins is going to be a little bit different than the tension for the plastic bobbins, because these are more slippery, and the plastic bobbins are what I prefer, and they do grab a little bit more, but on the other hand, sometimes they don't pull out as easy. But again, once I get my tension just right, I don't have problems with either one of them. The metal bobbins, one negative is that they are a little bit heavier, but that can also be a positive whenever you're doing a chain. I like to have a little bit of weight hanging off my finger like that. So practice with both types of bobbins and see which one you like the best. So as far as assembly, it's pretty simple as long as you have all the supplies you need. Again, this is a size 832 thread a screw and the nut to match, and class 66 bobbins. And get your screws more than a ½ inch long. 3/4 would work well, or 1 inch, and that way you have some that you can measure and cut off. And print up your little spacers and your shuttle, and you're good to go.